Hello everybody and welcome back to the future of the Fortress. It's 2026, and the Bay 12 Games website still looks like this. And on the 1st of January of this new year, Tarn has a report and a future of the Fortress. If you're not familiar with the future of the Fortress, it's a combination of a community Q&A and progress report, where Tarn Adams talks on the forums about everything related to the development of Dwarf Fortress. If you'd like to take part in these discussions, I will link the forum thread in the description of this video. 2025 was a heck of a year for the game, and so there's only one correct place to begin this year's future of the Fortress, and that is with the Bay 12 Games report. Toady writes, after the patch for the Siege update on the 19th of December, we got a little bit of framework going for the upcoming Magic editions. We're going to pivot back to another routine patch, and then back to Magic again. There isn't much to report on the Magic front yet. We're still feeling things out with how the world needs to change. The ongoing winter sale is going well enough. We sold 18,000 copies in December. That's 6,000 copies less than last December, but our November this year was 8,000 copies better than last year. So I think Siege November was just borrowing from December this year. Thank you, Tarn, for the report. And now I think it's time to move on to the future of the Fortress. The first question comes in from Zisudra, and they write, is difficulty tracked per attacking civilization or origin site? And Tarn's response is, the difficulty settings are saved per fort. Then each individual civilization tracks their own initial level, which increases with grievances, and with the number of times they have attacked. So you can get a small new attack from Civ B between a large mature attacks from Civ A. And a strangely formatted two-parter from a curious cat, which is more or less one question, so I will read it as such. And they say, what is the current state of Wayland support, if any, in Dwarf Fortress? And what are your future plans, and if any, with regards to the aforementioned technology? Also, could you answer the same questions concerning support for SDL 2.04 and or higher? I'm asking these questions because many Linux distributions have had Wayland as the default for years now, and some have even announced plans to drop support for X11, as also have both GNOME and KDE. And Tarn's response is, we tend to adopt things slowly. I don't know anything about Linux, but I imagine we'll try to tackle things around the time it's almost too late. And a question comes in from Slow Per Sun, and they say, is Siege pathing only initially calculated on Siege start, or without possible prior knowledge checks, or is it spread out across multiple prior checks? I get that the pathing can also update mid-siege, mostly just curious if the agent system has been tied to siege pathing yet. So, depending on how successful an agent's infiltration is, or multiple attempts, initial pathing might be partially predetermined, with the trade-off. I guess the siege generation value has a lower score, both from the predetermination but also whether mining and bridging is necessary, etc. And Tarn's response is, siege pathing uses information from prior attacks, and information about which traps have been discovered. It also updates with information from the current attack. But I don't understand enough elements of your question, that I imagine we're not talking about the exact same things. And a two-parter, with an interesting response, from NMJ, and they say, as magic begins to take shape in upcoming updates, do you expect that artifacts created by moody dwarves might sometimes emerge with magical properties? Or will the enchantment of objects be limited to laboratory work or experiments by wizard dwarves? And in adventure mode, I once received a quest to recover a magical item, some kind of enchanted bark for a temple. I remember hearing that such items could already have magical effects. Do you expect that quest items like these will eventually serve as materials for crafting magical devices? For example, a wizard using bark to forge a magical shield imbued with the same powers? And Tarn quotes DPH Kraken in their response, so I will read DPH Kraken's response first. And they write, for crafted artifacts, the starting point is artifacts that are beneficial and not that well understood, and possibly have conditions on them. In 2010, Adams said that the matter of historical artifacts like sanity relics or dragon-slaying swords was also noted, with magic able to draw on the object's connection to certain events. And in response to the second part of NMJ's question, DPH Kraken writes, remnants were previously mentioned in the Myth Generator demo, and they include a timestamp to the original video. Depending on their state, remnants could be crafted into magical artifacts for their presence, and used to create such an object. Some powers simply required possession of the object, while others required an additional cost or component to access. The spheres of the item influence what magic is available, as is the case today, though the list isn't very long right now.
So now we have some remnants of creation here. We had a cosmic egg, and that gave us cosmic egg fragments. If I can click on them. Small remnants of creation, almost impossible to find, floating over the landscape. You can become polluted by becoming exposed to them, but if you grab one of these floating cosmic egg fragments, you can carve a runestone of eternity. And that gives you various powers by holding the runestone.
And Tarn's note at the end of the question is as follows. Yeah, as DPH Kraken notes, these kind of improvements are the general idea, including these specific improvements. And we'll see what we get this time. Some pieces of it, anyway. A question comes in from the Marmot, and they say, is there any reason why the game generates out of nowhere 7 dwarves instead of taking dwarves from historical figures' populations, other than to fill the gap if a civilization is dying and has less than 10 members left? Or are these just remnants from the early versions? Are there plans for the enemy armies to come to a fortress from a realistic direction? I remember back in the early Steam releases, goblin armies would always appear from the side that had mountains, which usually made forts using the local terrain as barriers kinda useless, since the goblins wouldn't need to climb to the player walls. Finally, is there going to be some sort of tiredness system to units going through certain terrains, such as a kobold getting tired from going uphill, or horses slowing down on certain terrains like deserts and snowy places? And they add one final question to this sneaky multi-parter where they ask, will ASCII players eventually be able to see dyed cloth in a similar way to graphics players once the display the worn clothing dies fort mode is achieved? And Tarn's response is, using historical figures is complicated because it would make less sense for you to be able to pick their skills, but it's something that we've thought about doing for years, in Adventure Mode 2 as an option. At some point, we'll make the army pathing better. The trend has been in the opposite direction, though, since it's annoying to get them to deal with rivers, etc. It would be reasonable for there to be more effects from moving in different directions. No idea when we'll next be looking at that. And it always worked that way in Adventure Mode. Upper body clothing determined the character color. I guess it didn't carry over properly for the ASCII versions. Question comes in from Immortal D, and they say, have you considered giving the battering ram wheels like a pseudo-wagon? It's so slow that I'm defeating the siege before it even reaches the underground. And Tarn's response is, I guess the speed itself is the issue, not the wheels. I did think they were a bit slow in testing and sped them up, but they could probably use some more, as long as they don't get far ahead. A question comes in from Fantastic Dwarf, and they say, it's exciting to hear about wizards again for the Siege update. It makes me remember the old roadmap and harkening back way back to the 2D, when the Necro armies would deliver prophetic nightmares and demand apprentices. Will necromancers be a subtype of wizard at all, or are the secret holders set apart from the wizards by a couple of key differences? I suppose we could see what could be done about doing some roundabout trickery, like having the land give power to a specific caste, so that some of the entity leader advisors can fit a wizard amongst them. And Tarn's response is, I don't know how to answer the question. There are different sorts of knowledge, but they're all broadly wizard subtypes. The way the secret currently affects the necromancer is definitely at an extreme end, since the knowledge completely changes their behavior. And a two-parter from Willful Wraith, and they write, with the roadmap moving closer to the inclusion of resident wizards and broader magic systems, I'm curious about the visual and descriptive identity of these figures will take. Given the game's root in classic fantasy, should we expect wizards to adhere to the traditional Tolkien-esque archetype with pointy hats and staves and robes, or will their aesthetic be treated procedurally like the magic systems themselves? Could we see scenarios where the look of a wizard varies by world, perhaps requiring specific regalia in one history that mimics the classic fantasy style, while in another they are indistinguishable from the common peasant? Essentially, is the goal to keep them visually distinct and recognizable across all worlds, completely randomized, or a choice made by the player, through a menu perhaps, or the generator? And Tarn's response is, we wanted them to look distinct when appropriate. And if we get there this time, they certainly won't all look like standard wizards, since doing it with more variety is in the mode of the game, and also about the same amount of work. Eventually, we want other people in society to recognize them as a distinct sort of thing, in situations when that would make sense. And we certainly haven't done that yet. People just don't care properly about necromancers or intelligent undead they see right now, for instance. When I say, if we get there this time, I mean things like, needs a special object to do magic. It's unclear right now what modes of magic we'll be adding, but if we do get to an object-based mode, then that will be the start of appearances as well. The purely social differences are also important, traditional dress, etc., and we'll see what we get. And the second part of Willful Wraith's question is as follows. I know this question, as it relates to adventure mode, is likely very far down the list, if it represents a goal at all, but in fantasy, role-playing romance can be very fulfilling for the narrative. Are there any thoughts on allowing adventurers to form romantic bonds with companions, or even a fated connection, upon meeting someone in the world? It feels like this would drive immense emergent narrative, potentially offering specific retirement goals, ranging from building a simple home to settle down with a fellow adventurer, to a high fantasy conclusion where you must earn a title or renown to be a high status partner, effectively becoming a noble or a ruler as a condition of the union. What are your thoughts or plans regarding this? And Tarn quotes two posters, Dick Butt de Great and DPH Kraken, so I will read their posts first, before reading Tarn's reply. Dick Butt de Great writes, as per Toadie's intended vision, the only romance you can form is with the Night Troll after being kidnapped off-screen. Although previously on the outdated Dwarf Fortress Consolidated Development page, now outdated, there was a personal affirmation arc, which was planned that it would have addressed the feature. And based on what there is to be read about it, the opportunity to gain a spouse in adventure mode was originally planned as a reward for the player, borrowing from various old school and classical fantasy tropes, and would tie into the game's reputation system, and they provide this screenshot detailing the affirmation arc. Meanwhile, DPH Kraken's response to the question is as follows. Tarn threatened us with procedural love poetry in the last thread, so it's not out of the question. I believe it's entangled with retirement plans so that your adventurer behaves consistently off-camera, since the adventurer has a special undefined sexuality distinct from asexuality. And lastly, we have Tarn's response, which is, I think the replies address this one. We've thought about it, it's a fine thing, and we haven't got there yet. A question from Stained Class. It's a three-parter, and they say, will pregnancy simulation be expanded upon, with things like movement or fighting malice, requiring larger clothes, or will it stick to a few changes to none, with babies spawning at the mother's feet? And Tarn's response is, it's not a priority. Anyway, I don't imagine anyone would be happy having special clothes to make, the way clothing for humans currently works. And part 2 of Stained Class questions, and they say, why are many creatures hidden and unspawnable in vanilla object testing arena? May this change or become tweakable in the settings? And Tarn's response is, it could just be time to remove the arena restricted tag. You could already do it with a mod. It doesn't serve much purpose now, so it should probably be removed from vanilla too. And the last of Stained Class questions, we have news about wizards and sorcerers coming soon. Will they have mostly intelligent undead powers at first, or will they have brand new powers? What new powers do you see yourself adding to the game first? And Tarn's response is, there will be new stuff, and what that new stuff is will be decided as we go. Explosions and magical defenses have been explicitly mentioned, but we have a long wish list of effects. Next, there's a question from the Winter 22044, and they say, first off, I was wondering if the enemies have priorities when trying to force their way into your fort. For example, since as far as I know, the material of walls now impacts how fast they dig through, would they prioritize a wall of clay over one made of hard rock? I ask because that certainly could lead to some interesting ways to basically still guide enemies from somewhere you want them. And secondly, each siege seems to have some sort of general or leader, right? I have heard that when you kill the leader of the siege, it affects the rest of the enemies. Like when the leader of the siege was defeated, the other enemies regrouped outside before attacking again. Do these leaders affect the troops in other ways that could potentially make them high-value targets you would want to take out early? Like making the troops smarter while their leader is alive? For example, by making them more likely to avoid traps, and less likely to retreat, and potentially even more likely to do the above-mentioned prioritization of weaker materials. Or, if not, are there plans to implement this? And Tarn's response is, there are some pathways for the invaders. Yeah, between constructed versus natural and horizontal versus vertical. They don't look at specific materials during pathing, and even with the recent addition of the material differences, since it's more expensive, and there aren't many differences between the stones currently, aside from obsidian and adamantine. But they will tend to break constructions before digging natural walls. At the default, they're just as soon to deconstruct 5 tiles as they are to dig 2 natural tiles, as walk 100 steps. And in regards to the generals and leaders, it doesn't currently do little leadership skill choices or anything. But it would be nice, yeah. A question comes in from Central Speaker Dan, and they say, magic in any modern fantasy works has come to focus broadly on individual casters or small groups with clearly defined spells and immediate effects. In the past, magic is often seen as an indirect, natural, or communal thing, rather than belonging to a single caster. This kind of magic is usually difficult to include in a game, where direct control might only extend to a single character. But Dwarf Fortress already has a variety of group activities, with various roles that dwarves partake in, such as dancing and lectures and demonstrations and so on. Might we see forms of magic in Dwarf Fortress that are communal group activities, which may or may not be conducted at specific times, or have delayed or indirect effects, such as seasonal festivals? And Tarn's response is, we have some notes along these lines. Yeah, when it came to temple rituals and other rituals, and yeah, it'll be handy to have all the exciting activities in place. The next question comes in from B. Diamond Shaker, and they say, following your mention of improving army functionality, do you have any plans adjusting how off-map combat is simulated? As I understand it, they currently happen as a series of one-on-one duels, and don't seem to take into account or put much weight on physical qualities or abilities, like flight or fire breathing, causing squad raids to be unrealistically unsuccessful, and mega beasts to die very easily during or after World Gen. And Tarn quotes Putnam's response, so I will read it first. And she writes, fire breathing and flight and web shooting are actually all taken into account. Interestingly, the most important thing here is actually body size, and by quite a large margin. The reason you see megabeasts dying very easily isn't because their size isn't taken into account, but because they get into hundreds or thousands of fights, and only need to get unlucky once. And Tarn's response is, we might not touch site attacks or battle mechanics this time, if it doesn't come up. But we're going to be seeing a lot of battles during dev and testing, and the fights are very silly, so it is on my mind. The next question comes in from Orcleus. Orcleus? I give ye uppius. And they write, seeing how as of the Siege update, goblins now bring a wider variety of cavern creatures with them on sieges, I was wondering if it was possible to see the goblins using tamed creatures typically exclusive to evil biomes in their siege attacks, like harpies or stranglers. I think it would be a cool idea if the goblins were the monster tamers of the game, bringing such creatures with them in sieges, as well as allowing you to get creatures from evil biomes in fortress mode by raiding goblin sites or capturing them when they appear as invaders without needing to start a fortress within an evil biome. I understand a lot of this would be dependent on World Gen, I'm just curious if it's something we can see in the future. And Tarn's response is, it's reasonable. They get ogres and beak dogs as well, as I recall, based on what creatures are in the area. Ogres, at least, and beak dogs seem to be more common, but it would be reasonable for some additional creatures. It might take a bit for stranglers to want to just not be monstrous, but more organized. It feels like some things would need to be magically controlled. Next up, we have a 4-parter question from Big, and they ask, in the old Three-Toe story, magic could have a chance of physically corrupting the user. Will the new magic be used by the new wizards in the upcoming release potentially have the chance of corrupting the caster? Or would it be similar to necromancers where just learning the magic induces physical change to the caster? In their case, immortality. And Tarn's response is, it's in the prototype, and we'll see if it carries over this time. Certainly something we want to do. Some types of physical corruption are easier to do than others, just because of how the body system works. The second part of Beeg's 4-parter is as follows. How might adventurers go about finding these non-evil wizards and learn magic from them? And Tarn's response is, as there will be resident wizards in player forts, we're assuming also we're going to have resident wizards set up and starting in World Gen in other sites. Whether they have anything to teach you is a different additional matter, but it's the beginning of the process. There are still critters like necromancers with slabs off at their towers, and we want to end up with additional situations even on the first pass. And of course, the third part of Beeg's questions, how many types of crafting will be available to adventurers? Will they be able to use everything they craft, or would more niche goods only be good for selling in town? And Tarn quotes DPH Craction and says that they're correct, that we're aiming for parity with fort mode, and so we'll read DPH Kraken's response. The energy I've heard is getting parity with fortress mode, writes DPH Kraken. I imagine that getting into your own armor and backpack production would help the typical playstyle, and adventure farming is on the dev pages. Most items are decently usable in adventure mode. Clothing, jewelry can be equipped, and containers hold things. There's even silliness with giving people goblets. Construction and medicine aren't as useful, but only for a lack of trying. And with that completing the third of 4 questions, let's move on to the fourth one. And Beeg writes, since adventure mode cabins are getting a rework, might being able to build a cabin in a hamlet or a town be on the table to aid in the fantasy life sim of living in a town? And Tarn's response is, building within the city limits is somewhat more annoying because of how sites are currently stored. Hopefully it will eventually be possible, although it should also get some more attention from the existing residents. The next question comes in from Urist McSaddist, and they say, will secondary spheres of the fortress deity you use to protect your fort affect things? Will it affect petitions, like a nature-based one demanding you cut less trees, similar to the elves, or a murder-based one demanding sacrifices? And Tarn's response is, I'm not sure how much we'll get to the side effects at first, but it definitely is one of the important things to get a proper atmosphere going. Currently, every dwarven civ has a deity of fortresses, and that deity almost always has other spheres of influence. And we were thinking of that as one of the big levers to differentiate stuff as we go. It's unclear whether it'll work that way, or whether the variety will just come in from other angles. But yeah, we're thinking about it. The next question comes in from Cryosync, and they say, honestly, something that I doubt would be added due to how much work it would take, but would be really cool, would be more specific animal-people interactions based on the animal that they are. I don't know, I find that the idea of a plague of thrip men coming to take your food in a swarm a funny idea, or something else like that. I know it's a bit of a meme, but I am also genuinely curious why the giant desert scorpion. Was it just that dangerous, or was it just because, compared to the giant cave spider, it was just a really slow form of death to deal with? And Tarn's response is, we should probably get the animals themselves more differentiated as well. But ultimately, yeah, it would be cool. And Tarn quotes DPH Kraken and their response to the giant desert scorpion comment, so we'll read that first. And they say, I think it was conceptually replaced by the giant bark scorpion, a more ecologically specific creature. And Tarn's response is, yeah, DPH Kraken is correct. We'd like other types of giant desert scorpions, of course, as we'd like some other types of giant creatures. But it was odd having a generic and specific version of the same sort of creature. There's a question from Burdendi, and they write, the Siege update didn't seem to touch the basic combat mechanics very much. If we imagine a sliding scale where on one extreme you have a tactical RTS style combat that allows you to control each individual unit, and on the other extreme you have something akin to Dwarf Fortress's current very hands-off battles. Where would you like Dwarf Fortress to ideally sit with how much control the player has over what the dwarves do in combat? And what kind of changes might we expect to see to this in the future? For example, the kind of stuff I'm thinking of, right now, there's not much you can do beyond sending squads into combat, to fight to the death, after which the only way to get them to retreat involves undrafting them to make them revert to civilian AI, and that might cause them to run away. I've long been hoping for some stuff like basic formations and slightly more coordinated retreats. And Tarn's response is, It's partially your choice. You could give every individual dwarf orders right now. It would just be annoying. But it's not a power we're planning on taking away. And we still want vague general orders that also get the job done. We've mentioned cross-mode stuff in the past and in the current dev page. For instance, controlling a squad as if it were an adventure mode party, and that requires some care, since there will be technical and player role issues if it's allowed to be too free. But if you commit to changing to a squad for a good while during a journey, I don't really have a problem with that. On the other hand, out on the world map, the default will be using messengers and having very little direct information. Regarding formations, it's been on the cards for a long time, and we got close once. And it hasn't come back around. It's certainly something we want to do. There are so few creatures versus the number of play tiles. Everything's too thin for a lot of real-world stuff to make sense, but formations would still be useful in a bunch of situations. The next question comes in from Slow Per Sun, and they say, "Been meaning to ask regarding the Invaders since the Siege update added behavioral roles to Invaders. I'm assuming mostly referring to diggers and builders, and the necessary underlying code for selecting dig and build sites. But also better control of ranged units or flyers. This leads to some questions that, as far as I can tell, haven't been specifically answered yet. What, if any, immediate command roles exist once a siege allows for significantly large enough invasion to warrant a sub-commanders? As an example, some single unit that is necessary for the invaders to control of larger cohorts beyond a single commander, whether divided by role or just by unit type or whatever. Is there any communication between commanders and sub-commanders required or at least simulated? If invader inter-army communication is necessary for sufficiently large invasions, then how? Messengers carrying messages might be a little too realistic for a game to bother simulating, so maybe line of sight, special units, waving flags, music, drums, horns, or fifes, etc.? Also, has a long history. I guess it goes without saying that once magic is implemented, it may allow for supporting or at least providing some substitute methods for any of the above. And Tarn's response is, there's nothing like this at this point. We've had a few anti-depositions along these lines, but they aren't currently used. I'm happy enough that sieges now work somewhat, and making them harder for the enemy is something we'd have to be careful about. And a question from Keo1995, and they say, now that sieges are an actual threat, making the loss state of a siege much more likely, are you considering making sieges lost state something other than game over? Having an option to surrender mid-siege and become a vassal state to the invader or something. Having to pay tribute and dealing with a tyrant goblin overseer as a noble sounds cool. And Tarn's response is, we have a section of the siege notes for this, yeah. It would be cool to have to organize a rebellion against your goblin overlords from inside the fort, but it wasn't the priority for the update, so we didn't make it. Another question from the unpronounceable name Orcius, and they say, with magic coming in the game, will we see any changes to the existing items that will allow them to be used in magical experiments or to create stuff such as potions or magical items by wizards and other relevant characters? An easy example I can think of is when you butcher fire snakes and get their blood, which has no use except selling it for a decent value. This sounds like the type of material an alchemist would use in some type of fire potion or spell. And Tarn's response is, yeah, this sort of thing is squarely on the table. And a question from Drackley, and they say, there's a bug regarding giant animals and animal people based on vermin that only spawn in murky pools. Giant animals and animal people copy their biomes from the normal animals or vermin they're based on, but murky pools can only spawn vermin and not creatures. As a result, giant variations of pond turtles, dragonflies, and damselflies, and toads, and the animal folk versions of the same cannot exist in the world without modding it to give them new spawn biomes. The bug also affects creatures like snapping turtles, but they have other places they can spawn. I can't recall if there's a bug tracker tracked for it. The new bug tracker site seems to be down as of this posting. As a lifelong fan of giant toads and giant turtles, I wanted to raise awareness of the question, summed up as, can it be fixed? Please? Tarn briefly quotes Quietist, who more or less stated that the bug tracker was down most likely due to AI scraping. Thanks, planet Earth. And Tarn's response to the question is, I've recently learned about it, so it's on my radar now anyway. Thanks for adding it to the tracker, Quietist. The next question comes in from RDA, and they say, will the magic release make necromancers less likely to summon or revive things that are hostile to themselves? My current fort had some necromancers with the ability to summon boogeymen, so anytime they got spooked, they would summon up hostile boogeymen, which either killed the necromancer or other dwarves. Similar issues with reviving enemy undead that remains hostile. And Tarn's response is, I'm sure any bugs with the magic stuff are more likely to get looked at. And a question from Juice Seeger, and they say, about explosions, will these be the same category as the current breath attacks, material emission, in other words, procedurally generated but fixed per world, so magic? Or is this more like chemistry or alchemy-based thing, with collecting the right ingredients and mixing them in the right proportions? And Tarn's response is, eventually we'll have some basic real-world explosions, but I get the feeling we won't be starting from that point. And a bit of an off-topic one coming in from Asfade, and they say, how much of an influence was Tropico 1 on Dwarf Fortress? I've been on the nostalgic gaming kick recently, and I've booted up the original Tropico. After wrapping up my most recent fort, Pop Top, my beloved, rest in peace, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between how the dwarves are handled in Dwarf Fortress, how the citizens are handled in Tropico 1. In both games, people are simulated individually, with a high level of detail. People in Tropico have a list of needs with different weights depending on personality. They also have traits in various levels, leadership, bravery, intelligence, and etc. And they cannot be directly commanded and have to be influenced to get anything done. Mood and management is essential to prevent a regime collapse, and the experiment with the Dwarven economy is also reminiscent of Tropico's economy. Of course, they're two very different games, and both games that I still enjoy very much. Still, I'm curious if any influence from Tropico went into Dwarf Fortress. And Tarn's response is, I never played Tropico, but Zach did. The Sims and Majesty have also come up in the year before, so more detailed agents and having them be more independent was getting to be a thing generally. So I imagine it had an impact. We arrived at indirect control through a very sideways route, our mutant mining game, and we arrived at autonomous creatures more through where Ultima 7 was going some years earlier. But I think it's ultimately all the same soup. Next up, we have a question from Tempov, and they say, do you have plans to add visuals for weapons and items in hands as well as clothing and armor on the body? This also applies to randomly generated divine items, like the ones found on the guards in vaults. I'm sure that not only those whose brain breaks when seeing a creature that looks naked and empty-handed, when the reality is it's wearing armor and holding a weapon. Experiments and animal people don't have anything displayed on their bodies at all. I realize that this process is likely time-consuming, but perhaps the graphics could be added gradually. For example, a few races every few patches. RDA also has an addition to this question, and they say, adding to this question, do you have any plans to add icons for artifacts that are generated with an adjective, as in frilly skirts? Currently invisible artifacts are very hard to keep track of. When I place them on a pedestal, I never know if they've been stolen or if they're just invisible. This also makes the Mountain Home quest feel a bit bugged, since half of the artifacts that you need for that tend to be invisible. And Tarn's response is, it isn't an easy thing to do. We've tried to keep animal people and experiment bodies with some broad groups, so we can show wields and some worn items. A lot of graphics have already been drawn, but there's still a mess of offsets and such to handle. And that, and more, still need to be handled at some point. And can't really be done creature by creature with any benefit. The core technical obstacles are the main problem. We don't just want a giant text file with manual layering for each one. There are way too many animal people for that. It has to be smaller through the addition of new syntax and tools. We were hoping getting the Lua up would help with the offsets, but I'm not sure if that'll be much the case. And yeah, the missing item icons are annoying. We have many of the images, I think, although maybe not for every adjective. I just need to implement them. And a question from Stained Class, and they say, do you have plans to add new world creation tweaks for picky players who want something really specific, like having no civilization isolated alone on an island continent, and having at least 80% of goblin civs still having their original master after 250 years. And Tarn's response is, things are supposed to die, although I agree they probably die a bit too quickly. A parameter like have at least 80% of goblin civs still having their original master in 250 years doesn't seem to have an implementation at all that doesn't involve world rejects or increasingly improbable rescues. All the same, I think the next release will have some broad mitigation for these issues since we're changing how history works as the first myths drop. And a final question from Rhino, who asks, would Dwarf Fortress benefit from a 3D programmer, or perhaps a team of modernizing the old systems and whatnot? Rome of Oxtrot often demoralizes the masses with rants about tech debt, and they seem to really know their shit, apparently. I see a lot of parallels with Putnam, wherein this individual carries all manner of relevant credentials, while also being ultra plugged into the community. So I wanted to ask if it has crossed your mind. And Tarn's response is, it depends on what you are talking about. I think the peripheral stuff would be easier for somebody to update without introducing new problems. It takes a while to get used to the guts of the game, and there are lots of them. A team would be a whole thing though, and not something I want to take on at this point. And that brings us to the end of this month's Future of the Fortress, and the first of 2026. I will say that, based on that last question, I will forever be a little bit annoyed when I hear people being a bummer about games like Dwarf Fortress having tech debt. Yeah, it has tech debt. That's part of what having a codebase that old means. You're kind of asking somebody who is an auteur making a specific thing that they like to make that process of making that thing completely different. As an example, there are filmmakers who like directing and working in that specific role, but you might like their films and want more films. So instead of asking them to simply continue doing the thing that they like doing, you tell them to start a studio and then become the CEO of that studio and manage 15 directors making 15 different films. That's a very different job proposition. Yeah, there are examples of auteurs who started off making something unique and then moved into a different role or stayed in a similar role as the thing grew around them. Sid Meier would be an example of this, who still works on the Civilization games to this day as a programmer. All in all, if Tarn doesn't want a team, I don't think people should berate him for not wanting a team. I think that that's completely fine. Bringing on an occasional additional programmer who already knows the code inside and out is a big deal, and I think has been a massive benefit to the game. But for the moment, from my perspective, it seems like the most important thing is that Tarn is happy working on the game, more so than the speed of tech debt getting fixed and updates releasing. I think everybody would like to see the game run faster, play better, and look better, and feel more complete, but at the end of the day, we're playing Dwarf Fortress because there isn't anything else like it. Not because it's perfect. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope to see you in more of these in 2026. I hope to make more of these in 2026, and I've got some other things cooking in the oven right now. Keep an eye on this channel if you like Dwarf Fortress, and maybe some other stuff as well. And I'll see you sooner than you might think.